And I had one body of research on human mobility and gender in HIV, and another on doing qualitative and mixed methods research embedded within clinical trials and implementation studies, pragmatic clinical trials in Africa. And through that work on mobility in Africa, saw that, first of all, mobility is a very, basic household livelihood strategy in Africa, and Africans are very much on the move and have multiple residences that they circulate between, and both men and women are equally participant in it, and that has changed a lot in recent years. And the HIV research was still very based in an idea of a kind of like community as a kind of place of intervention, and conceiving of communities as kind of contained and static, or clinic-based interventions also. But each of these were not fully adequately addressing the social reality. And I became interested in social network interventions after doing a lot of work, looking at how mobility was impacting on the potential of basically modifying and attenuating the effectiveness of existing HIV interventions, because they weren't kind of capturing this reality. And the truth is, through ethnographic work, I saw that households are geographically stretched in Africa, and a lot of specific subpopulations of people are highly mobile, and it's of course those populations of people where HIV incidence was highest, but they're very socially connected. So they might be geographically stretched. There might be a great deal of kind of temporal dynamic relationships. Temporally dynamic, geographically dynamic, but socially very, very interconnected. And that's what got me interested in social network interventions. Social networks as a kind of a site of intervention, as a kind of unit of intervention. So that is what led me to this work that I was really lucky to connect with Jim on. And I'm presenting some very recent findings of our study, the Owete Study, which means brothers in Duluo, Ngimi Maber, meaning brothers in good health. So at any point in this talk, stop me if you have a question, okay? Just raise your hand. So we sought to determine whether an HIV status neutral social network-based approach could promote HIV testing, linkage to care and prevention, and better health outcomes in men. And we were basically all about identification from Tom's talk, finding the right guys, selecting highly socially connected men within networks and recruiting them to act as promoters to other men in their close social networks of HIV testing and linkage for confirmatory testing, either PrEP if they're HIV negative, or ART for treatment if they were not already in care. And we also incentivized linkage with a low-cost financial voucher for transport reimbursement. So our rationale was that basically the epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa could not be ended without better engaging men in testing, prevention, and treatment. And the 95 targets, the UNAIDS targets, were not being met in the region because men are less likely than women still to get tested for HIV. Engaging men remains challenging because they're less likely than women to enroll in PrEP or ART. They're more likely to default from treatment and have virological failure. They have a lower life expectancy on ART than women because they have a harder time adhering. And highly mobile men, for example, men working in fishing communities and other kinds of highly mobile occupations, have especially low uptake of testing and linkage to ART and PrEP. So basically, these, this group of men are really, involved in the continued persistence of HIV in the region, and that to get that last missing 27% and that 95, you have to engage mobile men in improving their engagement with services. But we chose to work in Siaya County in Western Kenya, which is on Lake Victoria. Transmission risks remain high in the fishing communities surrounding Lake Victoria. HIV incidence has been very high and HIV prevalence very high. my own work for many years in the area led me to publish some work around a kind of a unique cultural attribute of the area, which is that fish are really embedded, transactional sex is embedded within the fish value chain, where women exchange money and also sex to get access to fish to be able to sell on the local market. It's different on the Uganda side. If there's time, we can talk about it. But within Kenya, women actually are the ones who sell the fish locally. I mean, men sell the fish if it's for the export market, sending fish to Dubai and the nice restaurants in Nairobi, and the expensive, good, highly remunerative fish men sell. But otherwise, women are selling locally. And to get access to that, there's a transactional sex system called the Jaboya system. So this contributes to the ongoing high HIV incidence in these communities. Meanwhile, they're very isolated, they're very rural, they're very remote. So our Owete intervention was designed to address the social, cultural, and structural barriers to men's engagement in testing, prevention, and treatment using HIV self-testing, which we knew can help to bridge the testing gap, but we also knew we needed to work on strategies for better, more optimal distribution of HIV self-tests, and also to improve post-self-test linkage to health facilities. We wanted to use a social network-based approach to kind of leverage the properties of social networks inherently, building on the diffusion of innovation theory, and also thinking about building on the power of social influence and vicarious efficacy. Who knows what vicarious efficacy is? Raise your hand. Anybody know what vicarious efficacy is? Okay, Miranda, can you tell us? That's right. So this is from Bandura, social cognitive theory. I see someone socially similar to me successfully doing the new scary thing. I therefore feel I can do it. So it's a kind of, we drew on multiple theories. We're not just about network theory here in this study, but thinking about how do people change behaviors, especially stigmatized and difficult to adopt behaviors. So selecting highly connected men to act as promoters might help their close male peers to overcome cultural and social barriers to testing. We also knew that low-cost financial incentives could possibly help facilitate linkage by just addressing the cost barriers and providing a behavioral cue to action. Someone else might know cue to action from other behavioral theories that have been mentioned here. So just a thing that kind of tips you over into doing the thing that you've been. Maybe you're at the kind of pre-contemplation stage. Maybe you've moved to contemplation and you're about to prepare to do it, and it's that thing that just knocks you over the edge to do the thing. So we had 3 aims. First, to increase men's HIV testing via secondary distributions of HIV self-tests. Secondly, to improve linkage to care and prevention. And third, to look at the impact of the interventions on ART or PrEP adherence and retention. And so we had these specific outcomes, self-reported testing. Also, we validated that with the return of the used self-test kits at the clinics. We measured linkage to ART and PrEP using, again, self-report, but also clinic reports. And then for the viral suppression measures, we actually used the viral load data collected in the study, and we had a urine tenofovir test that we were able to use to also measure PrEP adherence. So we could validate self-report with the objective biomarker data. And our methods, this was a cluster randomized trial where the unit of randomization were the clusters of close social networks of fishermen randomized 1-to-1 in 3 beach communities in Siaya, selected on the basis of size, non-contiguity, and local leadership support. Among fishermen working in fisheries, we recruited them using a BMU registry, which is at every beach landing site. Kenya Government of Fishery, the Department of Fisheries requires that men who are working at a given beach have to be registered. They collect a little tax from them, right? So they have to pay a little tax to be able to work at that beach landing site. So the BMU has these records, these registries. We thought, fantastic sampling frame, where they collect the their names and their IDs and their phone numbers and what boat crew they're on, et cetera. So we're able to use that as a sampling frame. And we updated those registries, which was not a trivial step, and we screened and recruited and enrolled the eligible men who gave informed consent to participate. So we did promoter selection using social network analysis, and Jim, we're so lucky to have worked with you around this work. The roles of the promoter were to provide testing information and promote treatment and prevention. In the intervention arm, the men got instruction in how to use self-tests and how to explain self-test use to other people, and how to talk with other men about testing without forcing them to disclose their test results, how to kind of encourage and support without pressuring. We did didactic training, and we covered HIV infection and transmission basics, PrEP and ART, and in the intervention arm, they got an additional set of training on how to use self-test kits. So in the control arm, it was like a one-day training. In the intervention arm, it was a two-day training. And in the end of the day of the training, the men in the intervention clusters got vouchers that can be exchanged for 500 shillings, which is about $4. So they gave out the self-test kit and the voucher to the men in their networks that they could then use, and then when they linked, they could go to that clinic and they get their 500 shillings after they, go through confirmatory testing, get screened for eligibility for PrEP, or get re-enrolled in ART if they're not enrolled, or start ART if they're not yet enrolled. And in the control arm clusters, they didn't get the vouchers, but they did get like a referral card, which we thought they could use to go to the clinics and exchange for a self-test kit. It didn't end up being the case that they could get self-test kits at the clinics, unfortunately. But they were able to go there and they get facility-based testing. So these were the conditions. We also had some retention support via SMS in the intervention arm. So just follow up very non-intrusive, non-sensitive SMS messages. Prioritize your health, And the standard of care for ART or PrEP, fortunately at that point, PrEP and ART were, before the cancellation of USAID and PEPFAR, these medications were available. In our name generators, we collected information on the contacts related to food and borrowing, food borrowing and food sharing related to co-work in the fishing industry, leisure and relaxation and just enjoyment, money management, financial matters, health issues, emotional support, and even close personal secrets, which we tried out in the pilot beach only. The actual social network survey in our context, using these 6 domains basically, took about an hour actually, in Duluo. And we also did a qualitative study where we had men participating in in-depth discussions and focus group discussions, in-depth interviews and focus groups at selected time points where we were really trying to understand the mechanisms of action, potentially, understand perceived benefits or challenges with HIV self-testing, linkage, uptake, and adherence to PrEP or ART. And these, again, were our outcomes, and they were measured with multi-level mixed effects. Logistic regression with cluster-adjusted standard errors, adjusting for clustering of the social network clusters. So on to the results. And a side note, all of the photos here are either in the public domain or we had consent. So here is essentially our consort diagram, and we started out with an eligible population of almost 2,500 and ended up with basically 934 men who were participating in the social network survey with his name generators. Jim, bless his heart, had to do a lot to identify distinct social network clusters to identify non-overlapping clusters, just for the purpose of our clinical trial, and had to drop, we had to drop isolates, and had to identify network central guys within each of these clusters so that we could then select them to train them to be promoters. So following that, we had, a number that participated in the baseline survey and in our midline survey, so at 3 and 6 months after the baseline. Despite all of these steps, and despite the very high mobility of the population, we had really high retention of 88% of the men from baseline to 3-month follow-up. Sorry, 6-month was only clinic data extraction. So the actual data collection was at baseline in 3 months. So here, on to the results. And this is Jim's slide. And here is his beautiful sociogram. And apropos of his presentation on how to display information that is informative, here is a very informative sociogram of the first community. And you can see that I don't know if he has a pointer here, but here are our nodes with size of the node proportional to the number of ties, and also the ties themselves, the thickness of the ties, showing the number of relations of the ties, showing the kind of proportion of number of relations of the ties for each of these ties from all of, between all of these nodes. And the middle shows the degree and edge weight distribution of these ties, and we see that basically most men were connected to almost 14 other men in the network. And he's color-coded this also, so you could see most of the nodes are in the orange range of the K-core scale, so they share ties with 7 or more other men in the network. And most of the ties were weak. 52% had only single channel relations, and 21% had 2. But there were some very strong ties in the network, with about 14% of the men having 4 or more types of relations with each other. And these, this was the core population from which to select promoters. In the second community, and that was a pilot community. We ended up using the pilot data from that community. So you can see in the second community it was a larger community, but it had a similar network structure where, in both of these cases, a very, very strong core network. There's no kind of peripheral segmentation of kind of other kind of sub-cores. So it's a very kind of cohesive community. And although higher degree overall, cohesion levels with the average degree being over 15. And each man had ties to just over, like most of the ties here were weak again, with 56% only having a single channel relation with others. So meaning like they only worked together or they only ate together, et cetera. 12% had 4 or more types of relations. And in both of these cases, also I didn't speak to the panel on the right here, the embeddedness distribution. In both of these cases, this distribution is really highly skewed. So 37% are at the highest K = 10 cohesion level, and 78% are 8 or higher. Jim, do you want to add anything about either of these two slides?
Just to say that I think it was a little surprising to us first how cohesive these beaches were.
Mm-hmm.
We kind of thought what we would do is come strict to a great community connection and already have these groups and we go on our way. And then it turned out that every group was connected to every other group. So a lot of the work engaged in changing our strategy a little bit to identify analytically separate groups, but it is still respected to cohesion and leadership.
Yeah, right. And so here's the third beach. It was a lot larger. It's the largest of the 3 beaches. And it's got this similar, very unified core structure, but you can see it's a little bit less cohesive than the other 2 beaches. The middle panel shows that on average, each man had ties to just under 13 other men. Most of the ties were, again, weak, with 49% having only a single channel relations and 23% having two, but again, 14% had four or more types of relations with one another. And the connectivity distribution was really different than the prior two beaches. Here you see it's a less skewed connectivity distribution with a wider range, wider group of people in the kind of 5 to 8 range. So somewhat different and a somewhat smaller deep tin core in Jim's language. So very interesting. And in conclusion, Jim's notes on this and Jim's kind of observations were that all of these were really highly conducive. And this potentially could be conducive, being conducive to easy diffusion of information. Most of the men were socially connected through a single relation type, but a small core of men had very strong, deep connections to other men across a number of different kind of domains or relation types. And Jim noted that this study had much, much higher cohesion levels than in other data sets that you've been working with. And we can comment more on that later, maybe, if we have time. Yeah. So our characteristics of our participants, the main thing to note is this is a very high poverty area. These are the poorest of the poor men in Kenya. There weren't any significant differences between our intervention clusters and our control clusters. Most men had primary or less education. So you think of the fishing occupations as one in which this is a kind of informal sector labor occupation that is available to men who have very little education. And most men were married. It's also Luo culture where there's polygyny. So about 20% of the men were in polygynous marriages. And on to our primary findings. To this key question, can a social network-based approach with small transport incentive increase HIV testing? Yes, and dramatically so. We were able to increase testing in over 60% of men in intervention clusters compared to 10% of men in control clusters. And self-test use was significantly higher. The odds ratio was 14, adjusted odds ratios of 14. So this blew our minds. This is much bigger. This was a much bigger effect than we expected. These findings were just published in the Lancet Global Health, by the way. We also looked at testing, HIV testing as an outcome, any modality, either facility-based or HIV self-testing. Again, 65% in intervention clusters compared to 31.3% in control clusters. Then the linkage outcome was also significant, and this was really important. We saw that 67.3% in intervention arm and 15.6% in control linked to a health facility for confirmatory testing. Then we looked at our third aim of PrEP adherence or viral suppression. There we didn't see a difference by arm in a self-report or via urine assay in PrEP adherence. And we also didn't see a difference by arm in our viral suppression. We didn't really have sufficient power to measure these outcomes for the same, but you can see a trend towards, potentially trend towards protection in terms of the figures, where we had 13.6% in the control and 18.8% in the intervention having detectable tenofovir levels in urine, and 40.2% in control and 35.7% in the intervention with detectable viral load at the 6-month follow-up. And this was just published, or it's just about to be published in AIDS. So here's the same data, if you prefer tables. But this also shows our PrEP uptake, which I just want to point out that, in the intervention arm, 19.7% in intervention and 19.6% in control clusters, we're using PrEP at 3 months. And the number reporting PrEP use, ever having used PrEP, was 4% at baseline. So although this is a kind of this is a null finding that was a great public health victory. So I was very happy to see this. And in terms of the kind of potential for, in terms of scalability, this was really important. Miranda. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry, HIV pre-exposure prophylaxis? Yeah, and it's an oral daily tablet, which, you know, most men really dislike, most people really dislike. So these usage rates of almost 20% are quite high. This is great, you know, considering that, you know, there are many, many interventions in Africa that have just been solely devoted to trying to promote PrEP uptake in men. It's very comparable to those that have just thrown a ton of intervention. So this was great. You can imagine if we have better prevention products like lenacapavir, like Cab-LA, the ones where we'll have injectables that can be taken every 2 months or twice a year, how impactful this could be. We also have some findings that, I'm sorry? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for those of you with a demography background, you can understand composition. And so you can see that, like, proportionally a higher proportion of men are getting linked in the intervention clusters than in the control clusters. So greater numbers, sheer numbers of men from intervention clusters are showing up at the clinics, in you know, greater numbers than men in the control arm. But as a proportion of the arms, there are similar numbers taking up PrEP once they're in the clinic, right? So we have qualitative findings that I hope will kind of open up some discussion around the theory around this. This is not yet published, but I think that these guys who are socially central are not necessarily opinion leaders. Like, we know qualitatively some of them are like drunkards, really popular for like buying the other guys drinks who are on their boat crew, right? These are not the ones where if we took the traditional public health approach and we said, who are your leaders? And we asked the local authorities. These are not the guys who would be kind of handpicked as opinion leaders. And they wouldn't necessarily have thought of themselves as opinion leaders, and they may not have even been named as such. But what they were known and trusted. And I think for HIV and STI and other kinds of behaviors that are stigmatized and more intimate or private, I think that this is the attribute that's most important. I think that what we found is that after the training, this is why I just felt like on every one of Tom's slides, I had a response like, you can move them from high trust and low expertise to high trust and high expertise. And then imagine what happens if you move on both those axes. You start on one axis already there, and you move them. Because through the training, they become comfortable distributing HIV self-test kits, talking about testing with other men, and then normalizing HIV testing and linkage. It's so many quotes I could have shared with you. I'm just sharing a few. The men in turn in their networks felt comfortable using the tests and even disclosing the results. Even though we emphasized in the training, we do not require for them to tell you their results. We just want you to encourage them to test. Here's how you can talk about all of these things with them without forcing them to disclose to you, because that's their right to choose whether they disclose to you or not. So we really emphasized all of that, but then we're disclosing to their promoters. It was easy to convince them to take the HIV test because I taught them, and then after talking as friends, they also understood me, so they just tested themselves without me forcing them. Being that it was men to men, it made work so easy. Men prefer other men to know their status more than women. This person, he's a very close friend. One day he told me, I've been given this paper to bring to you to go for HIV testing, and I told him, well, if you've brought it to me, then it's okay. So we both went, and we both were tested. So lots of kind of accompanying men, and even the control arm men kind of paying out of the pocket to get the transport to their guys in their networks to go to the clinic to test. I mean, men really stepped up in this role. So this was something that, you know, really bore out our hypothesis as a potential mechanism. But there were other findings that were unexpected. And I take a kind of interpretivist approach to qualitative research, following kind of Kathy Sharmaz's constructing grounded theory, and we want to be open to surprises, and we also want to generate theory. And we found evidence for really a process whereby men were fashioning a new valorized identity through their selection of being a promoter. And they talk about having improved social status and recognition, public recognition for their actions. And this was really transformative for these, again, men who are the poorest of the poor men, who otherwise do not have opportunities to have, you know, a leadership role. And they talked about, first of all, having an increased sense of responsibility for their own health. Like, first of all, these men love me, therefore I must love myself. Let me take care of myself by getting tested. And now I'm a role model, so let me first take responsibility in ways that I haven't. Then they were also, you know, developing their own self-efficacy and providing opportunities for vicarious efficacy for their men in the networks. They talked about how it brought them closer. In the 6-month follow-up data, it brought them closer to the guys in their networks. It also made them have more connections to other guys that they hadn't yet had. After the training, I got the courage. It gave me the guts to test myself. Before, people would not ask me about issues related to their lives. They felt those issues were private, but now someone can come to me and ask me something that concerns their health. Being with Owete has made me so famous, more than I used to be. And when I say these men love me, that's a direct quote. I found they love me, you know, that was a direct quote. Ever since I started distributing these vouchers that I was given, I can say our friendship has increased between me and them. So we're seeing kind of, you know, in the qualitative data at 6 months, kind of spillover effects and long-term effects. The ones that didn't want to test earlier now want to test, you know, so the laggards are coming forth, and they're going to the promoters. So there are limitations. We had stockouts of HIV self-tests at some of the clinics, as I mentioned. So they might not have been able to get, you know, in the control clusters, they were told they could get a self-test kit when they showed up, and then they found out they weren't, and some of them were upset and disappointed. There was, you know, spillover, because this is such a cohesive community. You can imagine how hard it was for the control cluster promoters. Like, I don't have money for you, you know, and that made it really hard for them. So they were like, but you should care about your health anyway, you know. But it just made their job so much harder, and they were frustrated. It was difficult reaching some men because these guys are highly mobile. They're following fish all over the lake. Some of them are going to Uganda and coming back and missing contacts. There's continuing confusion in the community between ART and PrEP. There's no visual distinction between PrEP and an older regimen of ART, Truvada basically. And this is not something unique to this community. This is ubiquitous, basically, in the region. But, you know, in terms of major problems, I would say that overall they've been minimal because of really, really good support. And we spent a lot of time on community, you know, engagement and preparation, working with the beach management units and the county and sub-county health management teams. So that is, you know, very important. Conclusions for us were a social network-based HIV status-neutral intervention improved testing and linkage outcomes in men as a really promising way to engagement and treatment. Can harness the power of social networks to diffuse new information, skills, and behaviors, supporting men to engage other male friends in prioritizing their health, can change social norms and facilitate men's uptake of services, and might be helpful, especially for engaging mobile populations in treatment and prevention. And I would add, not just around HIV, but, you know, just a variety of any kind of self-screening modalities that are coming through for STIs, for hepatitis, for chronic disease conditions, and so forth. I think that any kind of intervention that really harnesses the power of social networks and brings services closer via social networks has a lot of promise. But I promised Jim I would talk about the realities of doing this, and this is the only thing I disagree with Tom about. I don't think in the actual on-the-ground implementation of social network-based interventions in the context of Kenya, in this very rural, high-poverty setting, so full sociometric mapping would be too costly and time-consuming for most public health systems to be able to do, if you want to think about scalability of this kind of approach. The name generator, it's collecting data on up to 6 men across 6 relation types in 3 beach communities of about 150 to 300 fishermen, cost about $30,000 to $90,000 per beach. It varied by the size of the beach. And it took 4 interviewers surveying fishermen over 2 to 6 months, and also a data manager spending 6 to 8 days to clean and process the data. In part, it's about context and local culture, and there being a sort of small number of shared names. Onyango, Lugo, Yuki, this is Obama country. This is like all the kind of shared names, all starting with O or A. So differentiating between men with a kind of like smaller number of given names and smaller number of surnames and lots of nicknames among fishermen meant that there's just a lot of time identifying who these guys were and filling in the data. And then you have poverty and mobility, even though people are incredible at staying in contact, and they have a lot of financial incentive to stay in contact because they're sharing information about prices of fish, different landing sites, they're kind of coordinating crews. So cell phone use is ubiquitous, but phone contacts can be unstable. People run out of funds on their phone. I mean, all banking is on phones. It's incredible, actually. Kenya is so far ahead of us in terms of banking systems and phones. But people's, they run out of power. There's not electricity. So it's hard to stay in contact. So we do need lower cost surrogate methods for identifying network central people, whether they be friendship nomination method or we're actually going to be working on developing a kind of best data method from our data and comparing it with friendship nomination approach. Hopefully, if our scale-up study, which got a great impact score, actually gets funded in the current moment. We don't know. So that is, that's something that I think is next. I want to acknowledge everyone. My very close colleague in Kenya, Dr. Kwango, sadly passed away last year. So this is all in loving memory of this powerhouse, Kwango. And just want to thank all the collaborating institutions. Jim, thank you. And our funding, which is from the National Institute of Mental Health, that made all of this possible. Thank you.
This is a model of how to stay on schedule. Comments and questions, please.
Use of our data. Please see me. We do have a process for inviting your collaboration in our data. I don't have, we had to make some really careful choices about what to include in our survey, and I don't include a lot of those kind of indices from a lot of the behavioral models in the survey data. We certainly can explore it qualitatively. And there are kind of measures of mental health, there's the social network measures, we have alcohol and substance use measures, we have mobility measures, and lots of sexual behavior measures, but we don't have a lot of kind of psychometric kind of, all of the kind of measures that you would really want around kind of subjective role expectations and perceived. We have measures on perceived risk. We do have measures on perceived severity. So there's some things that could be modeled with some of the survey data. But I think vicarious efficacy is something that we are going to be writing about with our qualitative data. So some of that evidence is going to get filled in through the qualitative. Yeah. Yes?
Thank you, this is great. I was just curious if they're going to maybe
Can you say that again a little more loudly? I think I missed the first part of what you were
I
saying.
was just curious, like, if there were insights from the qualitative work that was contributing to, like, the central network of confusion.
Mm.
That seemed to be surprising, I think, for y'all. There being communities, but these people were pretty centrally connected to one another, despite the fact that there was only, like, actually, I think 14%
Mm.
for a lot of these singular relationships. So
Mhm.
are there any insights as to why?
Yeah, I mean, Jim might respond differently. For me, I wasn't that surprised at how cohesive they are, just understanding the context of kind of, this is a really rural area. Everybody who's at these living and working at these beach landing sites are there because of their engagement in the fishing industry. So there's already kind of like a shared participation in an economy that kind of everyone's livelihoods revolve around. So both the kind of geographic isolation and the kind of occupational, centrality of one major, and the fact that what you're seeing is just the people who are directly involved in fishing. So there might have been other people kind of scattered around in these communities who were just doing subsistence farming, maybe, and, just basically that would be it. It would be either fishing or subsistence farming. So we didn't get just the subsistence farmers and just the shopkeepers around the beach landing sites and so forth. We did get the guys who are the net menders and the mechanics and the boat builders and all of that. Those are fishing associated. But so I think, life revolves around fishing in these places. And I wasn't that surprised. But Jim might have another perspective.
So I was surprised, probably because of my ignorance, like anything else. But my assumption going into this project was that people are fishing in boats, and if you're stuck in a boat with each other, that's very strong ties, and the boat would be the thing that created these microclusters, and then you might have a little bit of connection over. As it turns out, people don't cluster in a single boat. They go into the beach, they find different boat people they work with all the time, so this thing goes over again, and you don't get that kind of foci around the boat.
Because people are switching crews, because they're also like not just on one boat. So they're switching crews. They might be doing omena fishing, which is like the nighttime lantern fishing, and then they switch to daytime fishing because the omena have gone away and it's Nile perch, and so now they're doing daytime fishing and there's another boat crew. And so it's just like, I think it points to the need for good ethnographic information.
And actually, I think it's part of the contribution to the success of the actual leadership project, because there is so many ways in which, especially that we're under the line itself, there's a lot of potential leaders here, because everyone has these opportunities, so we come in and layer over it, an individual or Owete, it's sort of like, oh, yeah, right, and so it creates this stuff on top of it. And I think I'd also reinforce that the complexity of the analysis was not on the intervention, the leadership intervention model, it was in evaluating the leadership intervention model. To do that for randomized controlled trial, you create the best you could, distinct intervention and control. And so to do that, the real work, the cluster analysis, the community actually, that was going to be our trick for that. We would use the natural divisions to separate. Now the natural divisions, we had to much more carefully identify local groups that were interested in, and then exclude the next two steps of the second. It was an iterative process to try to find leaders with assigned controls, accident
Yeah, and I'll just add, in my review of the literature, friendship nomination as an approach, has been validated against full sociometric approaches for identifying leaders and been found to be just as effective in the context of, like in the Kim article, large micronutrient campaigns in communities in the Honduras or something. So there have been a small number. There's some empirical evidence that friendship nomination approaches could be as effective. However, no one has looked at this in the context of HIV and other kind of sensitive and stigmatized behavior campaigns. So that's why I felt we still need to do that work. We still need to do. This is why this was so important, because people have not. It's not been done enough in yet in HIV research. So we have to find ways to do it better and more easily. Yes.
Thank you so much. This is fantastic. Really engaging. Thank you. One thing I'm wondering, please forgive my ignorance. I work in the government, but not in any of that. But the travels seem to actually nothing to do. I'm thinking of work that I've done in gaslighting and we see very different dynamics in when we characterize things as leader positions for changing and novel adoption of thought versus permission dynamics. When it comes to more of the group was previously an aspect of the group is now something.
Mm-hmm.
And in the context of post-grad rotation, that's a negative thing we're worried about. But in the context of who the critical players are we see as very distinct. It's a different thing of like, follow me this way, this is now we can learn about what we didn't allow ourselves to talk about. I'm wondering if maybe some of that in the evolution, because the communities are so dense, it then doesn't actually surprise me at all that it's so effective. I wonder if there's consideration of those contrasting dynamics. Leaders of permission givers. Or
Mm.
best people are in the language what you do are those two things.
I mean, I think it depends on the nature of what's being transmitted. I think it depends on the nature of what is being disseminated and what it is that permission is being given about. I actually think it's like about that, because when it's something that has to do with things that you would not want to publicly discuss, then it's the people who are the trusted and close people who are going to be most important, I think, from our data. So if it would be something that is not a very, very close personal kind of matter, like HIV status is something that people don't talk about with other people, not only because of stigma, but also just because of the real emotional content of how do I feel about having a life-threatening chronic illness. Versus, let's talk about how we as parents feel about allowing our daughters to get access to contraception. That's a thing that we can all kind of talk about as parents. Even though we might have strong personal opinions and they might get really heated or emotional, then I think maybe you'd have somebody who's an opinion leader, kind of more traditional opinion leader, saying, it's going to be okay for us to allow them to have access to family planning. Might be a thing versus, So I feel like it's in the nature of what we're the topic of discussion, or the kind of like the specific kind of normative belief. Yes.
I think this was really, thank you for that. It really got me thinking. Do you have a sense how ubiquitous it is that people are aware of HIV things in their network, like for connections?
I think that people are not, I think that what's been said in this meeting so far is true, that people are not necessarily the most reliable interlocutors when it comes to other people's health status in general. I think that what we saw in this context is, you know, an intervention that resulted in disclosure within those small network clusters, so that probably by the end of it, they would be more reliable than they would have been at the beginning. Does that answer your question?
It does, but if you weren't getting the sense that, like, very behaviors, right, start giving someone who has HIV here.
So knowing, this being in a context of, you know, everybody having lived through, everyone has lost people. Like, everyone went through the wave of very high mortality. Every household has been affected. So what has happened in terms of perceptions of severity of HIV disease has really changed since the advent of antiretrovirals, such that now I think you will see lower perceived severity of HIV, especially among younger people, and that being less salient. People still just assume, I mean, so many men were shocked to find that they were HIV negative. So men are kind of like basically assuming that they have HIV because the partnership concurrency levels are super, super high. And by the way, we use a life history calendar, a sexual relationship history calendar approach, so we could measure concurrency without having to ask people like the number of women they're sleeping with right now, directly. So we've been able to get much, and I use this in my prior work too. So we see much higher concurrency levels than you get from like the AIDS impact surveys and that kind of thing. So they know they're engaging in higher risk sexual behavior, and they know they're at risk of HIV, and they assume they're HIV positive, and they can't believe they're not HIV positive. So sometimes they're just avoiding testing because they just don't want to have the confirmation. So, and then they're shocked when they test negative. So I don't think I'm directly answering your question. Yeah.
I work in breast cancer, and
Yeah.
totally different. We find people have specifically recent diagnosis.
Yeah.
They don't like mammogram.
Yeah.
Really,
Right. So, I mean, the thing is that they don't want to know that they're HIV positive, but less now because 10 years ago, they thought it meant sudden death. Now it's just like, I am so not interested in having to take that daily pill regimen. This is going to be so burdensome, But then there's plenty of people who are around them and they're like, I'm taking my medications out on the boat in the middle of the lake and it's normal and you'll be fine. And so things have been changing. There's another article that I wrote on, it was in Social Science and Medicine, on pathways for reductions of HIV stigma in the context of HIV test and treat trials, where we showed our kind of what we think are kind of mechanisms of action through which stigma would reduce through our years of qualitative research in the region.
I think we should probably wrap up that. We can look into